You can share the screen as well. Yeah, thank you. So, good afternoon, all participants. A very warm welcome to you all for this today's webinar on understanding CBAM regulations for Indian manufacturers. We are very glad to have such a diverse group of professionals joining this webinar, and we truly appreciate your participation in this webinar. I am Saurabh Kurtarkar, and I am managing training operations for Quality Austria Central Asia. Just to give a brief about our organization, Quality Austria has successfully completed a decade in delivering quality services with a workforce of around 3,200 employees and a strong client base of 2,100. With 26 offices across India, QACA is a leading service provider in certification, inspection, testing, training, cybersecurity, and sustainability. We hold multiple accreditations, including NABCB, QCI, IRCA, and ISO 17020. Additionally, we have our own labs for cold testing, material testing, and a cyber lab as well. QSCA is a leading service provider in telecom, automotive, built environment, manufacturing, uh, government, and petrochemical and coal. Next slide, sir. These are a few key clients with whom we operate. I'll just spend a few minutes here and then I'll proceed further. So you can just have a look at this clients. Before we proceed, just a few quick notes for all the participants. This webinar will run for approximately 1 hour, including the time for question and answer. If you have any questions during the session, please feel free to drop them in the chat box, or we have created a separate tab for Q&A, and we'll address them at the end of the session. Currently, you won't be able to unmute yourselves. We will allow you to unmute once the session is over and open for Q&A. We kindly request all the participants to just on their cameras during this webinar, as this will help create a more engaging environment and allowing a better connect. So just a humble request, everybody can just on their cameras. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our faculty for today's session, Mr. Siddharth Bhagwat. Mr. Siddharth is an expert in CBAM and sustainability. With extensive experience in life cycle assessment, climate policy, carbon pricing, and environmental regulation, Mr. Siddharth has helped numerous organizations navigate with the complexities of sustainability reporting and CBAM while developing effective strategies for compliance. Further, good afternoon, sir. Siddharth, sir. I'll just like to
Good
hand over
afternoon,
the session to
everyone.
you. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Saurabh, for the kind introduction. Yeah, just to add on to that, I have a very diverse background, but my specialty is, of course, in life cycle assessments and ESG reporting as well. And since CBAM has come into the picture, the industry, has evolved so much in terms of reporting that we also sort of equipped ourselves to, cater to that demand. So a lot of the CBAM work that we do falls directly under my purview. And my intention in this lecture, because we have only 1 hour, is I want to cover the main aspects of CBAM. I'll introduce CBAM to all of you. But mainly, I want to focus on how relevant is it for Indian manufacturers? What do Indian manufacturers need to do to prepare for the CBAM regulation? What sort of data do you need to collect and submit to the declarant? And how it may impact the markets going forward. So that's going to be the main topic for discussion today. And before we get started, I'd just like to request everyone to participate in a quick poll. If you could quickly take out your phones and scan the QR code, we would get a sense of the audience on how much are you aware about CBAM. So you've got options like completely not aware, you're aware but you don't know how to get started, or you might be already CBAM compliant, and finally you're CBAM compliant and you're taking steps to reduce your emissions. So this would give us a good indication of what the thought process is of our attendees today. All right, great. Thank you, everybody. So most of us, okay, are not aware about CBAM. So this would be a very good introductory, meet for you guys to look into. And those of you who know what CBAM is but don't know how to get started, we'll be covering that aspect as well during this lecture series. So, okay, without much ado, I'll get started. Yes, this is going to be our agenda, like I mentioned. We're going to be understanding what the regulation is about, why it has come into picture, what are the steps you need to take to prepare for CBAM, and why it matters to India, and what are the challenges that we could be facing as Indian MSMEs or Indian manufacturers who are supplying goods to the European Union. And finally, we'll open up the discussion, like Saurabh said, for a Q&A session. So basically, CBAM, what is it all about? So in Europe, they have set a target that they want to become net zero by 2050. And by what they mean by that is compared to their emissions in 1990, they have set a target that we want to reduce these emissions and go nearly completely net zero by 2050. So that's another 25 years from now. And because of this, they've started to track their emissions. They've started to track the goods which are produced inside the EU. And this whole, target EU kept, back in 2020, 2021. And they realized that even though they were measuring the emissions from their own continent, they needed a tool to collect the emissions data of the products that they were using, which were manufactured outside the European Union. So that's where CBAM really came into the picture, right? So it's to identify the emissions which are created through the manufacturing of the goods outside of the European Union, right? So like I said, companies exporting to the EU will need to report their emissions from 2023. So CBAM has started. So October 2023 was the first reporting period from October 23 to December. Uh, and that was the first time that this revamp regulation really started to collect all this emissions data. And we are right now in a period where they're only collecting the data about our emissions. They're not putting any taxations or any other restrictions as such as of now. That will come later into the picture in 2026. So ultimately, what CBAM will turn into is sort of like a carbon border tax, where if they find that your emissions, which are being imported into the EU, are higher than a specified benchmark. So for that balance high emissions, let's say the remaining higher emissions from your total emissions minus the benchmark is what you're going to be taxed at, right? So that's the intention, that CBAM certificates are going to be given to declarants, wherein they're going to tax the high emission goods which are coming into the EU. And this is very closely linked to the current EU's cap and trade system, where they are, where they've mandated industries in the EU to sort of given targets to reduce their carbon emissions. And this exact principle is what they are going to extend to outside of the European Union, which is where CBAM has really come into the picture. So why the net zero target and agenda? As you all know, we are grappled with this global issue of climate change and global warming, where the Earth's mean temperature is slowly increasing. That's leading to severe weather events, severe droughts. We are also facing a rate of sea level rise, quite alarmingly. So these are some of the various reasons why companies and countries around the world have set a net zero target. So for EU, it's 2050. India has set a target for 2070. China has also set its own net zero target. Major companies globally have also set their net zero targets. Even in Indian companies like Reliance, Mahindra, Tata's, they've all set their net zero targets because of this very problem. And just to break it down at a granular level, what we mean by global warming, what's the source of this entire problem, is that the carbon emissions in our atmosphere have reached to an all-time high, right? If you see thousands and thousands of years, even before today, the carbon emission levels never increased above, let's say, 280 or 290 ppm, right? It never went above this level. But suddenly now, over the last 200 years, we've seen a big shoot of emissions, right? And that is the main reason why companies want to bring down those emissions to natural levels. It could be by 2050, 20 by 2060, or even 70. Doesn't matter. But the intention is that we need to bring our emission levels down to this level, right? So that's the whole idea behind having net zero targets. And having net zero targets also leads to tracking of your emissions, right? So that's why in Europe, where they've said that they want to be carbon neutral by 2050, it means they have to track all the emissions, the direct emissions from the continent, the indirect emissions from the continent, and so forth. And so under the Fit for 55 policy by the European Commission, um, this ambition, further seeks to establish that the EU as a global leader in climate change. And since then, a lot of policies have come across through the EU, like the emissions trading system, um, and now the CBAM, that's the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So slowly now, I think CBAM has been a very big global game changer as far as policies and regulations around sustainability is concerned. So historically speaking, since sustainability reporting came into picture, since the Kyoto Protocol came into picture, since the Paris Agreement came into picture, CBAM has now been the latest major global shaking regulation in sustainability. And the role of CBAM and the intention behind this is to, of course, gather the emissions data of the goods which are exported to the EU, that's the European Union, at a factory and a process level, right? So they want to get granular data right down to the factory and the process that's used to produce the goods which are exported there. And ultimately, what the European Union intends to do is uh, they want to set benchmarks. So, for example, if you're producing steel right now, which is at 3 tons per ton of steel, uh, and they might set a benchmark of say 2.5 tons, right? So your zero point 0.5 tons of CO2 emissions on the higher side, right? So you may have to pay tax for that amount of emission, right? But we still don't know what those benchmarks are. They are going to be announced in the second half of the year. So we still need to wait and see how this is going to play out, right? And of course, the major intention is to introduce the CBAM certificate as a carbon tax for high emission goods, right? Uh, so who all is this applicable to? The objective is to, of course, prevent leakage and ensure fair pricing of imports with high carbon footprints, right? And in total, it covers these sectors. That's the steel and iron, the aluminum, cement, electricity, fertilizers, and hydrogen. And we may come across more sectors in the future. But right now, these are the main 6 sectors which are targeted. And in India, what's going to be the most relevant for us is the iron and steel sector and the aluminum sector, right? And partly the cement and fertilizer sector as well. So, like I mentioned, all the countries, including Indian countries, other Asian countries, African countries, American countries, they all have to submit their CBAM reports, right? And like I mentioned, right now we are in the transition period, which means from October 2023 until 31st of December 2025. So until the end of this year, we are in the transition period. So right now we have to submit our emissions data. We are not going to be taxed yet on any high carbon products which we are exporting. Also, one major difference that's going to come in from next year, that's from the 1st of January 2026, is apart from additional tax which are going to be paid through CBAM certificates, they've also mandated CBAM verification of all our reports and documents. So whatever data we are submitting to the declarant, to your company or to the trading system in the EU, it is required to have the entire template of communication verified, where they will check all the documentation. So where you've got your data from for production or for the use of fuel or electricity and so forth. So all of this is going to be now verified from next year. And CBAM is only applicable to goods with consignment value of more than 150 euros. So anything below that is not going to be considered. And this is the cap that CBAM has put in place for the submission of CBAM data. So where does CBAM really fit in? I'm sure all of us have realized at some point during the journey that there's too much reporting and calculations to be done on sustainability. So just to put CBAM into picture, we have, of course, the sustainability reporting or the ESG reporting part, which is already taking place. The top 1,000 listed companies on the stock market in India are mandated to do BRSR reporting, right? A lot of us Indian manufacturers also do GRI reporting if their customer is demanding for it. And if, for example, a specific investor is asking for it. Then apart from that, CDP is the Climate Disclosure Project. This is basically a rating, an ESG rating given to an organization based on their environmental, social, and governance parameters. And of course, SBTi is the science-based targets, where a company looks at their scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions and sets target to get to net zero by 2030 or 2040, 2050 or so forth. And if you are SBTi compliant, it means, okay, you've scientifically looked at your emissions, you've looked at the cost benefit analysis, the investments required to go to net zero, and your target and your action plan is compliant with them. And this is where really CBAM falls in. It's going to be one more, let's say, submission that your sustainability team or your EHS, the environment, health and safety team, or the quality assurance team, really takes up at a ground level. And this is going to impact a lot of the board decisions which are made at the company, right? Because this looks at the company as a whole. This looks at the rating of your ESG parameters. CBAM looks at the emissions of the goods exported to the EU. And at a product level, we also have the EPDs and the Green Pros, or the life cycle assessments, so to speak, where you're trying to find out the footprint of a product uh, uh, at a unit level, right? So for example, it could be a LCA of a door or a fastener, for example, or a clothing shirt, right? So this is what's done at a product level. Green Pro is the green product certification given out by CII, where they look at the entire manufacturing plants, how green is it, and give you a certification accordingly. So this is an overview of the sustainability reporting or sustainability, let's say, aspects that are going to be looked at a company. And CBAM is going to be now a very, very crucial part for companies who are exporting to the EU. So before I go along, I just want to start at a granular level and explain some of the terms that are used in CBAM submissions, right? So I'll start with the first one, that's the carbon emissions. This is your scope 1 to 3 emissions. So your direct emissions from the factory, like it could be a diesel genset, could be vehicles owned by the factory, right? The emissions coming in from there. Scope 2 deals with your indirect supply of emission from the grid electricity. And scope 3 deals with your raw materials, your external transport, your waste that is generated, and so forth, right? There are more than 12 plus categories in scope 3 that are usually assessed. So carbon emissions are calculated at an organization level. And from a European perspective, right, when you are purchasing, or let's say when you are importing a good into the EU, you need to look at the embedded emissions associated with that product. That's embedded emissions as in what is the carbon emission required to manufacture that product, which is getting imported into the EU. That's your embedded emissions, right? So the direct and indirect, direct is of course from the factory premises or factory owned or company owned appliances and machines. Indirect emissions is your use of electricity coming in from the grid, your purchasing of raw materials, goods and services, your factory assets, then, for example, the waste that is generated and so forth. All of that comes under indirect emissions. Precursors, you must have heard this term also. So precursors is a term given by the EU which describes the input material or the raw material that is used to manufacture your product. Importers and exporters, I think this is pretty self-explanatory for you all. Installations are called basically by the EU as manufacturing units. So if you have a manufacturing unit somewhere in Pune or Bombay or Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, one factory is called as one installation, right? So that's a terminology used under CBAM. Declarant is the authority organization or the person who's collecting your CBAM reports. So for example, if you have a client in the EU where you are submitting all your CBAM data, that organization or that individual is the declarant. So it's their job to collect the data from all the manufacturing units or suppliers all over the world and submit it to the European Commission and the Customs Authority, right? So that is the declarant. The EU Customs Department, so EU Customs Department along with the European Commission, these are two bodies which are going to be collecting all the CBAM data. So they will collect all the emission values which are submitted from all over the world and then hand it to the national competent authority. So in every country, for example, if you are submitting your products to Germany, in Germany, there's going to be a responsible authority that's going to look only at the CBAM data. In France, it will be another authority. In Spain, it will be another authority, and so forth. Then CN code or HS code, we all use these nomenclature systems to export the goods, right? So the CN code and HS code. So there's a list of these codes which are given under the CBAM directory, and I'll obviously talk about this later on in the presentation, where they have clearly mentioned the goods which are included under CBAM and those which are not. A CBAM facilitator would be somebody like an external consultant who's helping you, complete your CBAM assessments, and a CBAM accredited third-party verified professional. Uh, these are going to be bodies like Quality Austria, who verify the CBAM reports that you have generated. So all in all, these are the main terminologies that are going to be used under CBAM. And if you quickly scan this QR code, it will take you to the basically Annex 1 of the CBAM regulation, where it gives you an entire list of goods which are subject to CBAM reporting. So CBAM, even though we have those 6 sectors which are covered under CBAM, not all of the aluminum or not all of the iron and steel goods are going to be covered under this regulation. So I'll be sharing this document after our lecture as well, in case you're not able to scan the QR code right now. But based on the list that's given by the CBAM authorities, we first need to check whether our product code is really required to submit these CBAM documents or not. And another thing I can tell you from my own personal experience is that sometimes when we export our goods to the EU, it's under, let's say, one particular code, and then it gets converted to a different code within the EU itself, right? And finally, the end user sees a code. I mean, even though your CN code might not require CBAM submission, but the changed CBAM code at the European level, that if that is coming under the list, then even still they might contact you to submit the CBAM reports, right? So this is one experience I have had where, the Indian company's CN code was not really there in the list, but still they were mandated to do it because the CBAM coding system, I mean, the CN coding system really changed once the product entered the EU. So this is also something unique that we've experienced. So this is a quick overview of the entire reporting process. I'll of course get into the data collection part later on. But first, I would like you guys to understand overview of how this entire CBAM process works, right? So let's say we've created a CBAM, submission form and given it to the declarant. That's the client in the EU or the individual in the EU that's importing the product. So we have to give our data to the declarant. The declarant has to create a CBAM report from all of the goods that they are importing and submit that to the European Commission. The European sorry, the European Commission, along with the Customs Authority, then they look at your CBAM reports and start the vetting process, right? If they feel like you have not, collected the data from all your suppliers or all your manufacturing units, then the NCA, notifies the declarant to resubmit the data. If they feel like, okay, you've covered all your suppliers, Then it goes into a review with the national competent authority, right? And if the report is compliant, they immediately approve it. If the report is not compliant, then it goes as a request for amendment, a request for changes to the declarant, where the declarant will again reach out to you as a supplier to resend the data if it's been done incorrectly, right? And for example, national competent authority. So what could that be, right? As an example, I've listed the national competent authority of Germany. So in Germany, we have the Emissions Trading Authority that operates under the Federal Environment Agency of Germany. So that is the national competent authority identified within Germany to look at the CBAM data, right? And this is going to be different, like I said, in each European country where CBAM data is looked at. So what are the different emissions which are ultimately covered under CBAM? For those of you who might have read about this regulation, it might be a little confusing because CBAM collects your scope 1, 2, 3 data, but not in its entirety. And CBAM also looks at your product level emissions data, but it's not exactly linked towards life cycle assessment processes as well. So CBAM fits somewhere into in the common ground between these two. So mainly CBAM is there to collect and report your scope 1. That's the direct emissions generated from the production of CBAM goods at the installation. So the blue part is what is covered under CBAM, right? And not covered in CBAM is the gray part. So scope 3 is generally not considered under CBAM, except a couple of parameters of scope 3, like the input material, which is used to manufacture your product. So that is considered. So what I would say is scope 3 is partly considered. Scope 1 is completely considered. Scope 1 emissions might be your emissions from the diesel use, from fuel use in your production process. Let's say if you're doing powder coating, you might use gases, right, as a heating source. So all of these will come under your scope 1. Then the input material, you might be purchasing steel rebars, aluminum ingots to make your material. So that emission per ton or per kg will have to be calculated, and that comes under your scope 3. And finally, scope 2, which is the electricity consumed by the production of CBAM goods. So it looks at the electricity used by the manufacturing facility to produce that product, and this includes the renewable and the non-renewable part. So of course, if your entire electricity is coming from the grid, then you would just use the grid electricity. If let's say part of your energy is coming from solar power, then you could subtract those from the overall electricity consumption and then submit the data accordingly. So overall, these are the emissions of scope 1 to 3, which are considered in CBAM. Now, coming to the reporting, the first step that you need to, of course, do is check whether you are applicable to submit CBAM data. And that you can do, like I mentioned, by checking the CN and HSN code of your product and verifying it with the list of CBAM goods which are covered under CBAM. Then you need to submit annual or quarterly, emissions data of your product. Some companies have done it annually as well, but I would recommend that we stick to a quarterly CBAM submission format, as that is directly compliant with what is required by the declarant. What are you going to submit to the declarant? That's either a filled communications template. So I'll give you access to a link shortly where there is an Excel sheet given by the CBAM regulation authorities that one needs to fill. So we need, as installation, as manufacturers of Indian goods that are exported to the EU, we need to fill in this Excel sheet, this communications template, and then submit it to the declarant. Or the customer might send us their own, customized formats for filling in the CBAM data. And we have seen both cases where customers have their own digital portal that they give access to the manufacturers to submit the data. If that is not the case, then it would be recommended to stick to the communications template, right? Then you need to check whether you have the data that is required for the CBAM submissions. And mainly what electricity is something that you can easily get from your manufacturing unit. But what's going to be more difficult for you guys is to understand the emissions coming in from the raw materials or the input materials which are coming into your factory, right? So you need to reach out to your vendors or suppliers and ask them to please disclose the per ton or per kg or per unit of carbon emissions that product has. Then so after the 1st Jan 2026, we also need to get this template or the entire CBAM submission verified by an accredited third-party auditor. And if you don't want to do this from the communications template, then we have some portals available in the market like Maygreen or Carbon Chain, which are used globally to collect data from all the suppliers. And then bodies like Quality Austria or others can come and verify this as well. So this is a QR code to the link of the official CBAM page. So all of the things that I spoke about, like the list of the CN codes, how the communications template works, how you are supposed to fill it. All of that data is given onto this official CBAM page. I'll obviously share this page across through Saurabh to all the participants who've come here. So all in all, CBAM regulatory authorities have given a very detailed process and a matrix of how these submissions have to be done. And it's only a matter of going through it, reading to it properly to get it sorted. Right now, I'll come to the main part, which is the data that you need to collect for your CBAM submissions. So we start with some basic details of the company, right? What is the name of the company, the installation address, the coordinates of the manufacturing unit, and so forth. Then which are the exact CN codes of the product for which CBAM submission is being conducted. There you need to check your sheet whether the code name is correct and add that QR code. Sorry, not QR code, CN code. Then we also need to clearly mention what is the reporting period, right? Do you want to do it for the 1st quarter, 2nd quarter, or 3rd quarter of this year? Or are you going to do it annually for the entirety of 2024? So for example, right now, we are in February, right? So in February, by the end of Jan, actually, we needed to send the data of the last quarter of the previous year. So from October to December, that's the last quarter of 2024, the goods which are exported in this quarter had to be submitted to the declarant by the end of January. So when you're submitting quarterly data, you get a 1-month period after it to collect all the data and submit it to the declarant. And the declarant, if the declarant has uploaded the data in the report correctly, then it gets submitted to the EU portal. If that is not the case, you're going to hear back for amendments or changes in the reports. And the declarant will again get a time period of 1 month to make the correction and then resubmit those reports. So we need to be very clear about the names of goods which are covered under CBAM. Those have to be clearly written. Then the purchased precursors, that's the raw material input. Like I said, it could be aluminum ingot, it could be steel rebars, copper wires, steel wires, whatever you're using as an input material. We need to identify those values at a factory level and also at a process level and add that to the communications template. Then we also need to track the fuel consumption data of the manufacturing facility. So for example, if you're using any diesel or gas as part of your manufacturing process, that amount of gas or diesel has to be calculated in tons and declared in the communications template along with the emission factors. So emission factor is nothing but the factor or the unit for emissions of a particular type of fuel or energy. So for example, if you are saying that I'm using 10 kilograms of diesel in my manufacturing unit, the factor basically what it tells is, it tells you what is the emissions caused by diesel per kg, or what is the emissions caused by gas per kg or per cubic meter. And you need to multiply your total consumption of diesel by the emission factor to get the total emissions used in that process. So similarly, you will also need to find out the emission factors of the electricity consumption. All right, in India, I think the Central Electricity Authority has given a figure of 0.71. That means for every unit of electricity you're consuming, you're creating 0.71 kilograms of CO2 emissions, right? So for diesel, it's going to be around 2.6 or 2.7. For petrol, it might be different. For gas, it might be different. So you need to make a list of these emission factors accordingly. Then the direct emissions to air. So if during the production process you have any stack emissions, flue gases which are emitted directly into the atmosphere, we need to declare those in the communications template. And finally, which is the total quantity input into the production process and used in the production process, right? So for example, if your input is steel wires, right? And if you're producing something like fasteners or nuts and bolts, you're going to have a lot of wastage that comes out of the production process, right? So your input quantity might be very different from the output quantity, right? So CBAM also looks at how much wastage you're creating in the production process, and it calculates the emissions for that accordingly. And of course, if we are paying or already paying any carbon price for the emissions that we are producing, uh, then we need to disclose them as well in US dollars in the communications template. But in India, I don't think a lot of companies are really doing this right now. So all in all, this is the data that you need to collect uh, and be prepared for when you do any CBAM submissions. So why does it matter for India, right? India has a high volume of trade exposure to the EU, where almost 27% of our exports in iron, steel, and aluminum have gone there in 2022. And if CBAM comes into the picture, if taxation for the carbon emissions really start coming into picture, we could see a tariff increase of about 20 to 35% on imports of these high carbon goods. Now, this is a tentative figure. We could be wrong. It could be lower or even higher than this. We will only know this once the benchmark is out by the end of this year and once the EU sets the guidelines for the taxations. So India's stand for CBAM has always been very objectionary. So India, along with the other Asian countries, have objected to the EU CBAM policy time and time again, saying that it's going to be unfair for our manufacturers to pay this higher tax for the carbon emissions, right? So the case behind this is that European companies have set up manufacturing units outside of the EU because their own emission norms are so strong. They are so stringent, right? And there are other advantages. You know, you can manufacture a product cheaply, much better way, much more efficient way, and so forth. And ultimately, you're the one that's going to be taxing this. So it's a cost to be paid by the manufacturer, right? And this cost could deter Indian manufacturers to, release export products to the EU, or the EU might come and say, okay, unless you reduce your emissions, we are not going to take products from your manufacturing unit, right? So this is going to be quite a challenge from a market perspective to deal with CBAM. So there's been a lot of pressure from global suppliers to reduce and disclose emissions. And Indian suppliers, if we need to be CBAM compliant, and if we need to be very competitive in the market, where European companies still come to us, in Indian suppliers to purchase data, we need to make sure our emissions are lower than other countries as well, right? So China, for example, has set its own targets. It has its own emissions trading system. In India, we're going to come up with our own trading system as well, which could help us offset some of the emissions that we are producing. So these are the some of the ways in which it's going to impact India. There's a lot of positives to it. There's a lot of negatives to it as well. And ultimately, in the case of GST, the companies are paying it, their manufacturers are paying it, the raw material suppliers are paying it. But it's ultimately the end consumer which takes the burden of paying that tax, right? So we might see something similar, which eventually evolves in CBAM as well, where European consumers, who are the end consumers of that product, might have to pay that extra bit of burden. So some of the examples of CBAM readiness, right? If a company A, which primarily uses blast furnaces that rely on coal, will lead to high emissions, right, per ton of steel, while a company B, which has invested, let's say, in a hydrogen-based steel making process, is able to reduce its emissions per ton, right? So this is a technology change that a company has done to reduce its emissions per ton, right? Then another case where, let's say, if you're a cement manufacturer and you're using a clinker-based production, you're emitting about 8 to 900 kg of CO2 per ton. Your emissions could go down drastically if you use recycled materials like fly ash or slag, in this process. So ultimately, it's going to come down to how you're able to reduce your emissions per ton of goods that you're exporting. In this case, this company uses coal-powered electricity to produce aluminium, and company B, or let's say even the same company A, produces the low-carbon aluminium using hydroelectric power. Then you could reduce your emissions down drastically. Or if you use solar power, wind energy through an on-site or an off-site system, you could drastically reduce your emissions, right? And ultimately, we need to ensure that the emission values are at par or lower than the benchmark that's going to come across and announced by the end of this year, right? So we need to make sure that our product is low carbon, low emission. And I know this is a very long-term game. In the short term, it's going to hurt us more than, let's say, being advantageous, because we need to invest in changing our source of electricity, raw materials, and the technology that's used in production. So in the short term, it's going to be not so beneficial, but in the long term, it's going to be very beneficial moving forward. So some of the key challenges that you might come across is the lack of credible data from suppliers, right? Your raw material supplier, they might not know the emissions of that steel rod or the aluminum ingot that they're producing, and they might just Google you and give you random figures, right? So these are the things we want to avoid. Then, for example, there's also possibility of critical information being left out of a manufacturing process because you feel it's going to be very high emissions, so you might not disclose that, right? That's going to be a big, let's say, risk moving forward, and it could even result in penalties ultimately. It also brings a lot of administrative tasks, consultancy charges, verification charges to businesses, and because there's such limited awareness on CBAM, it might lead to some incorrect submissions or late submissions from our side, or not just from our side, but this could be happening all over the world. Ultimately, it might increase the price of the goods and bring in some market challenges that I spoke about, right? Uh, I'll quickly just run through this. So firstly, what do you need to do to prepare now? You need to understand the reporting requirements, identify what product codes are applicable to you for CBAM submissions, which are the major emission sources in your manufacturing units, right? Then do a greenhouse gas accounting or a life cycle assessment of your products. If you're a supplier of raw material to a manufacturing unit, then this is what you should be focusing on, because this is the data you need to give to your client that's ultimately manufacturing the data. And you need to make a plan to reduce the carbon intensity. That's the carbon emissions per ton of product which you're supplying. Right? You could shift to renewable energy. You could use cleaner fuels, alternative raw materials which are recycled in nature. So there's multiple ways in which we could reduce the carbon emissions, and seek third-party verification for all your submissions to make sure that we are already prepared up to international standards for CBAM reporting, and make sure that we complete quarterly timely submissions of all the data that's going to be submitted. This is a link to a blog which I follow on LinkedIn. So there's a very renowned expert, Mr. Nilesh Battad, who has been supporting the Indian industry for many years now for CBAM. So this is a blog I would recommend all of you to read. They have mentioned each sector-wise, how are you supposed to do the calculations, what do you need to report and not report, and so forth. And ultimately, what's in it for the Indian businesses? In India, the government is exploring an opportunity right now to come up with its own domestic carbon market, right? So to help our industries to align with global carbon pricing mechanisms. So if India comes up with its own carbon tax or a carbon price, which is lower than the European carbon price, then that would help us as manufacturers to lower the carbon emissions of the product, or to lower the taxes that are going to be paid to the European Union. Because if we are already paying taxes, carbon taxes in India, we don't need to again pay it for CBAM, right? So that's another advantage that the Indian carbon market could bring to us. We would also benefit from emissions trading scheme, as we would be able to offset our own emissions and subtract those from the CBAM goods, right? Like I mentioned, it's going to be quite beneficial. China already has this system in place. They already have their emission trading systems, and we must also follow suit. The emission benchmarks of the European Union that they're going to give for every product covered under CBAM is going to be released most likely in the second half of this year. And overall, the CBAM regulation really encourages decarbonization, reduction of carbon footprint at our industries. And so it gives us an opportunity to already start rethinking about the sustainability agenda, sustainability actionables that we're going to take at the company. And so we may need to increase the investments going into cleaner technologies, fuels, manufacturing processes moving forward. And ultimately, all of these actions are going to play with the global net zero emissions reduction target, right? So we all know that emission norms are going to be stricter year after year. And like I said, even though it's going to hurt us in the short term, it's going to be very beneficial for the entire industry, entire country, and even helping us reduce our global net zero emissions target. So that's it about CBAM, and some of the expert services that we could be providing through Quality Austria is, of course, we could be advisors to the manufacturing units or organizations who are just starting their CBAM journey or want to take it to the next level. We would also be curating some training programs where we'd go into sector-wise, in-depth knowledge of how you need to calculate the emissions, fill in the CBAM communications template, and so forth. And we will also be starting auditory services where we would third-party verify and provide assurance for the documentations that are going to be created under CBAM. And if you require any assistance in documentation, then we would be starting those services as well. So that's it from us. I think we have a few minutes to go for the question and answer session. So, Saurabh, I hand it over to you.
Yes, yes. So we have a couple of questions. Participants, anyhow, I've now you can unmute yourself and ask the questions. But initially, to start with, we have a few questions in the chat window, sir. So first is regarding, is CBAM applicable to aerospace industry?
So there are some industries which are exempt from CBAM. So for example, if you are in the military sector, military industries are exempt from CBAM. But if you're in the aerospace from a private perspective, then you need to check the CN codes and identify whether you would be exactly applicable for this or not.
Okay. So Hanuman sir, I think so this answers your question. Another one is from Mr. Satish sir. He has mentioned, is CBAM applicable at site installations at EU?
Site installations at EU, no. So the EU manufacturing units or installations in the EU have their own system of reporting emissions. CBAM is only strictly to countries who are outside of the European Union.
Okay. Thank you. We have, so can you please elaborate the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions?
Okay, all right. Maybe I can go back to that slide again. And so scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So for imagine your company, right? Your company has a manufacturing unit. Your company has requirement of fuel and raw materials to manufacture your product. Your company also requires electricity to produce goods at the factory location. And there's going to be a lot of traveling of employees, traveling of, you know, business trips that your marketing team does. So all the activities that are conducted in a company all lead to some sort of carbon emissions, right? And the entire idea of this scope 1, 2, 3 is to classify these carbon emissions and identify and measure these carbon emissions. So like I said, scope 1, it only deals with the direct emissions from your factory. So this calculates your direct emissions from stack. This calculates your emissions from the use of fuels like diesel or gas. and company owned vehicles. So these are direct emissions coming from the company. Then scope two is only the use of indirect emissions from electricity. So if your factory has a huge amount of electricity that is being used, that's going to come under scope two, right? So the electricity which is produced by the grid and supported to your factory, that comes under that. And scope three is all the indirect emissions. So whatever is not included in scope one and scope two falls under scope three. So that's your raw materials, your business travel, your employee commutes,
Even if the green energy
research
produced
produced.
is considered.
Sorry, please come again.
Hello? Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Even if the green energy product is considered under the scope 3?
No, if you're producing solar power, that you need to subtract from your scope 2 emissions. So for example, if you're using grid electricity, 50% grid electricity and 50% solar energy, you need to only consider that grid electricity in your scope 2.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. So yes, anything that doesn't fall under scope 1 and 2 comes under scope 3 ultimately. And if you look at the scope 1 to 3 bifurcation in a company, it's the scope 3 that contributes to the most of the emissions, right? Because that's coming from your entire supply chain and company operations.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yes, sir,
Yeah.
please.
You mentioned about the iron and steel, primarily applicable to iron, steel, cement, aluminum, like that. What happens if you are a user of iron, steel, and then you're exporting goods?
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, maybe car manufacturer, as a filter manufacturer, or some goods which you use iron and steel.
Okay. So if you are, let's say, so you mean exporting the final product to the EU?
Yeah, and then they are major users of iron and steel in their products.
Yeah, so what I would recommend in this case is check with the CN code. If your product falls under that CN code list, then you have to submit the CBAM data. Because like I said, not all the products are covered under this, right? Even if it's a steel or an aluminum product, not all are covered under CBAM right now. So you need to refer to that list. If your product falls in that list, then you need to send the data.
Okay. Now, is the current system equipped to differentiate between the genuine data and the greenwash data?
So good question.
Sorry, I'm asking very question.
What's happening right now is the European Union is only collecting the data right now. So right now they're not putting any fines, penalties, or even requirement of a verification process. So right now they might not be able to differentiate that. But when verification,
not just European Union, in general also.
See, if you want to fudge data, I think you can fudge data in some of the other way, right? But that's exactly when assurance and verification comes and plays a role to make sure that the data that you have calculated is authentic. So that's the importance of third-party verification. And if you see a lot of customers, they demand that if you are submitting me any sustainability report, please make sure it's third-party verified and you're publicly stating these claims. Because when you're accountable for it, that's when you know you will do it correctly.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, Siddharth, one question from my side.
Yeah.
We have seen scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. If we are doing the calculation of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, then part of that is applicable to CBAM, right?
Right.
So if we are doing scope 2, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, then CBAM reporting can happen. Nothing more is required. That is my first question.
If you have calculated your scope 1, 2, 3 data, if you've seen the communications template, the Excel file where you have to submit this data, you will see that yes, scope 1 entirely is required, scope 2 is required. But in scope 3, you need to only put your raw material emissions, right?
Yeah.
So they don't care about your transportation, your business travels, and all those things. So all of that you can leave out.
Yeah, we can reduce something, whatever required, that only we can report, but scope 1 and scope 2, scope 3 together complete the process. Minus something.
Yes, minus something.
Yeah. So one more thing, we are actually exporting a lot of things to Europe, and of course we have started getting the this reports requirement and all from our customers. What's happening is we are supplying something where aluminum is there and lot of polymers are there.
Okay.
So the uh, loading of this carbon footprint on the product will be only on the aluminum, because CN code they say like only aluminum is applicable, polymers are
That's
not
correct.
applicable. So proportionate to aluminum thing only will be uploaded on the system, because there
That's
is
correct.
no clarity anywhere.
Yes, that's right. So so if you're submitting, if you're exporting polymers, plastics, that you don't have to submit those data sets.
So uh, these are the part of product. A plus B becomes the product. A is polymer and B is the aluminum. That is how
Okay.
product is. Yeah.
Okay, so it's like a combined thing, but you need to
Yeah.
check whether this product would be covered under CBAM, because is it included in the list?
Yeah, it's a CN7 or something like that. It's included. I had checked it. It's included, but they had not clarified it.
Okay.
It's
Yeah,
kind
maybe
of
I can. What I would
it's
do,
kind,
Jitendra ji, is I'll write down your query and then maybe I can get back to you after the call.
yeah. Of course, I'm getting after this call. I'm going to catch hold of Saurabh and Amit, and of, of course,
Sure.
so we need to understand this little deeper, so that uh, at least whatever we say that is correct to best of our knowledge.
Right.
This also means too many compliances for the organizations, right? BRSR, CBAM, GRI.
Yes, like I showed mentioned in my slide, there's a lot of compliances which I've come across in sustainability, but ultimately what they're trying to communicate is the environmental performance of a product. It's just written in a different manner. So it could be at a product level or a company level or only the goods that you're exporting. It can get a little
And,
confusing, but yeah, this is how we're evolving.
Yeah,
and
different
people,
countries, different customers asking different data. Somebody is asking product life cycle carbon footprint. Somebody is asking GSG. Somebody now CBAM. So a lot of things are going on. We need to channelize, our processes and systems to ensure that we are able to address requirement of each and everyone. And
Yeah.
systems are in place so that, of course, we are able to collect and report the data in a systematic manner.
Right. So, but to sort of pinpoint and narrow down on one thing that you can do to be ready as compared to other things. So if you do a overall sustainability report of your organization, like through a BRSR or a GRI, I think that more or less captures all of the sustainability aspects that you need to report,
Yes.
right?
correct.
Yeah.
So that can be a good starting point, and then maybe you could explore other things like SBTI or CDP moving forward.
Sure, sure. Thank you, Siddharth.
Most welcome.
So there's one more question from Mr. Naik. Are there any bimetal considered under CBAM, excluding iron?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Are there any bimetal considered under CBAM, excluding iron?
Biometals, so far I have not come across this, but what I would do is, so he's also requested for the list of the CN codes. I
Yeah.
think after the call, then he would get a better understanding once he goes to the list.
Okay, fine. So we'll be sharing you this list after this call. So we'll be sharing this PPT as well as the list also, the other documents that would be useful for you to access. So another one is from where we can access the factors in India, example, diesel, electricity, etc.
Right. So there are a couple of sources that you can use. So for electricity, generally we take the data from the Central Electricity Authority. They publish a report every year of the grid performance, and in that they also mention what is the emission factor of every unit of electricity which is produced in India, and that's the national average. In terms of diesel and petrol, you could look at the GHG protocol emission factors. You can also look at some Indian specific factors which are published by TERI or the Petroleum Authority. In India, we also have the Steel Authority that publishes these figures for steel. So the emission factors will come from various sources, but you need to be making sure that this source is credible. Otherwise, if you do a quick Google search, you might find a variation of emission factors.
So this actually, I only asked this question, Siddharth.
Yeah.
We tried to search it out, and it was terrible. Not getting some correct information, lot of managed information. So how to rely on the data? Maybe if you having something, you can later let me know.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
So again, a benchmark is going to be per product, per annum, or per supplier. How to measure the carbon footprint is what.
So that benchmark is going to come at a product level. So for example, if your product is, let's say, steel, and if you're exporting, let's say, 100 tons of steel, so the benchmark is going to be for every CN code. So every CN code will have its own benchmark, right? And you need to be able to either meet that benchmark or go under that benchmark, right? Because if you're going above that benchmark, you're going to be taxed for that remaining higher emission that you're producing.
Can you please, what is net zero emission?
So the concept of net zero, basically, let's say as a company, if you're producing 1,000 tons of carbon emissions every year, then the idea, so what I would slightly rephrase this question, and I would say, okay, what is the difference between net zero and carbon neutral? Because we use these terms quite interchangeably. So net zero deals with reducing those 1,000 tons through actions within the company where you're nearly coming in at a zero level figure, and only the remaining emissions you offset or purchase carbon credits for it. In case of carbon neutrality, you only measure the carbon emissions in terms of CO2. In net zero, we look at all the greenhouse gases like CO2, could be nitrous oxide, sulfur oxide, all the chlorofluorocarbons and so forth. All of that is coming under net zero. In carbon neutrality, we only look at the CO2 figures. And even if you're not doing any activity on your own to reduce emissions, and if you're directly purchasing any offsets or carbon credits, you can still claim that you're carbon neutral, right? But that you can't say that you're net zero, because net zero first prioritizes actions that you need to take in your company to go to nearly zero and then offset the remaining ones.
Okay. So then can you please advise your service charge? So Sushil Kumar will get back to you. Our team would be connecting you after this call. So we'll brief you regarding that. Then does an organization need to document procedures before going for verification by third party?
Yes, I would highly recommend you keep all the documentation of the data sources ready with you. So for example, it could be like a logbook of your production figures. It could be your electricity bills, the invoices of the diesel consumption in your factory. So any data that you're putting into CBAM, it has to have a supporting document. Let's say if you're getting the carbon emission of your raw material from your supplier, you need to get it on their letterhead, that they are telling you that the footprint of that raw material is X amount. You need to get that on their letterhead as a supporting document, because that's a declaration coming in from the supplier. So yes, you need to have all the documentation in place.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Satish ji. We are in the project industry. We are install the project in European countries. We in our project assemble the parts, procure standard bought outs and manufactured parts. in our factory, and then we export to European countries, and also we install there. So what will be our scope boundaries for this CBAM?
Firstly, have you been mandated to do CBAM reporting?
No, just I asking for knowledge.
Yeah, so in this case, I doubt whether CBAM will be applicable. But in case, let's say, if you still have to go ahead with the submission, firstly, please check the list of the CN codes, whether your individual products or product as a whole falls under that. And in case it does fall under that, then you need to calculate the emissions of manufacturing that part or that product as a whole. And you need to submit that data to your declarant.
Some of the parts are we manufacture in-house also. Is there also data applicable for this?
Yes. If your product falls under the CBAM list, then only.
Okay. For only those. For fasteners, how it is for fasteners?
For fasteners, yes, fasteners are included in CBAM.
Okay. How to report this CBAM reporting?
So if you're manufacturing fasteners, then I would
No, we are not
recommend.
manufacturing. We are only assembling. Means we procure fasteners.
Okay. So you need to then only take the emissions of the fasteners because that's your raw material. That's part of your raw
From
input material.
supplier. From supplier.
Yes. So a supplier needs to tell you what is the footprint of their one fastener or one product that they're supplying to you.
Okay. So
And then,
all these applicable to all other parts like bought out standard motors, then your polymers is applicable to all same.
no,
From supplier you
not
have
everything.
to no.
So that's why I would recommend you look at that list first, so you will know what
Mhm.
parts, what raw materials you need to take in.
Okay. Thank you.
That's it. I think so. We don't have any more questions in the chat. Participants,
Okay.
please, if you can unmute yourself if you have questions. Still, we have few more minutes. Already, we are past 10 minutes more to the session. So,
Sir, I have one query. If you manufacture 500 tons and out of that only 100 tons export we do it to the Europe. So data is to be submitted for 100 ton or 500 ton.
You need to submit the entire 500 ton data to the declarant. But
Okay.
so what in the communications template, you will see a clear differentiation. So first you need to enter the factory level data. So that includes your entire production from the factory. Then
Okay.
after the factory level data is captured, then comes the process level emissions data. So that's where you can sort of narrow down to the production process that you are utilizing to export the data to the EU. But when you send the data to the declarant, to the client in the EU, your client will know how much of these raw products are they purchasing from you. So they will extract or subtract the data from their side.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Hello, this is Tushar.
Yeah.
I have a question that we have a project-based industry. So that's a number of the parts like iron, aluminum are in the projects. But we need to check the final product CIN from that list, right?
Yes, the CN
Okay.
code. Yeah.
If CN code of that final product is in the list, then only applicable for CBAM, right?
Yes.
Okay, but sometimes some parts are not sent with that consignment, and then separate part is submitted to the EU. Then need to check for that part CIN in that list, right?
Yeah. And only for that part which is in that list, you need to declare your emission values.
Right. Okay.
Not for the
Thank you.
rest. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Participants, we hope you found the session informative and valuable. So we again appreciate the time you took to join this session. And before we close, I'll just like to thank our expert, Siddharth sir. Thank you for sharing his expertise with us. So we really thank you for your time.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. I hope this session
Thank you,
was.
Siddharth. Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.